But now we are going to get into our main topic today, which is our look at Chapter 9 of the Dungeon Master's Guide of the 2014 5th edition D&D game. This chapter is called Dungeon Master's Workshop. Ooh, it doesn't get any more exciting than Dungeon Master's Workshop. Or does it? We'll find out. What do we hear in Chapter 9 about this Dungeon Master's Workshop, you ask? Well, let me tell you. One of the paragraphs that we call out here is the options in this chapter relate to many different parts of the game. Some of them are variants of rules, and others are entirely new rules. Each option represents a different genre, style of play, or both. Consider trying no more than one or two of the options at a time so that you can clearly assess their effects on your campaign before adding other options. And for me, that tone is perfect. It is, we're going to give you some optional things. Don't try them all at once. And evaluate how they work for your game. The one thing I wish they had done is to say, for example, because they do say, try these out, make sure they work. For example, flanking. This is why we took flanking out of the game. Some people love it for these reasons. This is why we took it out. And if you add it back to the game, this could be something that happens. Because it's one thing to say, test these out. It's another thing to warn someone about these little details, because those details are important. So I wish they'd taken that one more paragraph per section just to say pros and cons of using this.
The other thing I might say is they focus on these options, but in terms of Dungeon Master's Workshop, they don't really address, what about if I want to change something else? We had this question that came up recently on the show of the everything else. What do I do for everything else? And they don't say here how to handle everything else. And to go back and really address the why or how to think through whatever it is that you or your players want to tweak, and to think through all the touch points. And we'll talk more about touch points as we go through these, but I found it fascinating sometimes that my original take when I read this chapter was, oh, this feels like a list of why we didn't put these things into the game. Rather than, hey, this is awesome, try this. Maybe that was a cynical read, but I came away with that feeling. And it's like all of these things like, yeah, no, I don't want to put that in my game. The way this is written, no way I would do that. Almost like, don't tweak your game. And I think that there could have been a better conversation of, when you tweak your game, here are the things to look at. Now, here are these options. I don't know.
Part of me agrees with that. But I also understand why, because things did not get put into the core rules for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want to come out and say, as much as I want that, as a marketing thing, you don't want to say, hey, here are some new rules you can use. It's tough. So I appreciate the fact that these things are here. We could talk about each of them individually to maybe show examples of what we mean about what could have been added, taken away, or how it could have been differently presented.
Yeah. And can I just also say, like, the DMG, like, look at that art, right? Like, there are some pieces of art in this book that it's like I'm looking at for the first time, because I so seldom open this book to like really go through all of it. I go to specific sections and I forget like how there's just some great art in this book. And I almost think they should just reuse it elsewhere, because like we don't see it. We forget about it, right? Like, just reuse it so that people see these really cool art pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first part of this are ability options, they're called. They provide a plethora of options that the DMs can choose to use. So let's dig into them. Now, some of these you may recognize from playtest packets for D&D Next, which did, as we mentioned in the previous part of this episode, they went far afield on some of these playtest packets for D&D Next to really test out how they would play and if people would like them. So the first thing under ability options is proficiency dice. What we got with 5th edition was, as you go up in levels, you get a proficiency bonus. And that bonus is a static number +2 at first level, 1st through 4th, up to +6 at the highest levels. What we are suggested here as a alternative rule is, rather than having that static proficiency bonus, you roll a die in order to add something to your check if you are proficient. So instead of a static +2 at levels 1 to 4, you would roll a d4 and add that to your check because of your proficiency. And so they offer this in terms of skills as a way to change the game up a bit. Mm-hmm. What did you think about this when it was a playtest thing, Teos, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean,
as an alternate role.
What's really interesting about it is that, as I recall it and it changed in a couple different packets, but in a lot of the packets, it was, the rogue gets a D6 and the, barbarian gets a D4. And that meant that the different classes had the ability to hit these larger spikes if they got lucky. And rolled high on these dice. And then expertise might give you a larger die size. And this doesn't do that. This doesn't try to replicate what those packets are. It's really just creating swinginess, right? It's taking the static average of the die, dropping a 0.5 there and saying, well, your +2 proficiency bonus becomes a D4. Your +3 becomes a D6 and so on. So we're just getting the average of the die rounded down. And to me, that's not much of a system. It just creates more swinginess on top of the already swingy D20. And so I don't know what I'm really doing. This is, to me, perfect example of kind of a lot of these, which is that if this were a core rule from the game, lots of things would be playing off of this, right? There would be features in your class that might say, roll your proficiency die twice, take 1, right? There would be features that would say, expertise, bump up the die size, any number of other things, so that this sort of swinginess would be controlled and tailored to the experience. And you might even have a penalty where maybe you don't, disadvantage on your 2 dice roll. Lots could happen if this was a core rule. But when this becomes a little kind of add-on, I don't know that it does much for me. I don't know if you feel that way.
I think rather than saying I like it or I don't like it, the question is, what does it do to the game? What are the benefits of it? Like exactly what I said. Mm-hmm. Putting this here is fine. Giving it as an option is fine. What I want to know is, how does this mathematically change my game? Mm-hmm. What does a success or a failure mean in this game? Because you have a better chance of getting a high number, reaching a higher DC with this, but you also have the penalty of, even though you're good at something, still rolling very low, especially if you're doing opposed checks. Mm-hmm. So the high level rogue, with all of the advantage and expertise and stealth and all of that, could still fail a check against the drunken, half asleep guard. If the guard rolls a 20, even though they're -4, and you roll your D20 plus your 2D12, but you roll 1 on both of those D12s, all you're adding now is your dex, and that's only going to max out at probably a +5 or a +6. Mm-hmm. So you're now putting more likelihood that you will at some point fail, even if you're really good at something. Yeah. Now, if you want that in your game, then you want this system. If you don't want that in your game, then you don't want this system. Yeah, and so
Yeah.
that sort of thing just needs to be spelled out.
Yes.
If your game is heavily reliant where one failed check may turn the campaign on its head, or may, you're the one that does, well, if you fail your acrobatics check, you plunge 1,000 feet to your death. uh, then you want to be careful with using this system, because it is very likely that that is going to happen at some point. These failures will happen more often than they would otherwise. So that sort of thing needs to be spelled out. The
Yeah.
other thing is, somebody might read this and say, "Oh, well, if I use this proficiency die for skills, why am I not using it for saving throws? Why am I not using it for attack rolls?" And that's a whole different conversation.
Mm. And I think they try at times to sort of speak to this. Like the next one is the idea that you have ability check proficiency. Instead of skills, you use ability checks. And there was a playtest packet that also sort of worked this way, one of the early ones. So you, based on your class, have proficiency in your ability, and there are no real skills. And so the DM would just say, well, you're trying to hide, make me a dexterity check. And you might be or might not be proficient in it. And so if you are proficient, you add that proficiency bonus, the same that 5e has, +2 at your first levels. Um, and you add that to the ability check with no actual skill. And, it says it removes skills from the game, doesn't allow for much distinction among characters. You don't emphasize persuasion or intimidation. You're equally adept at both. Like, okay, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's a big, broad change. And why would I want this? And I don't know that it spells it out very well. And again, it makes me feel like I don't know that this is doing much, which I would say holds true, because we almost never hear of somebody saying, yeah, I use the optional blah, blah, blah rule from chapter 9 of the DMG. In fact, what you often hear is some designer or other person on the internet saying, oh, well, that's actually an optional rule in the DMG, to which I say, well, but it's not really supported. I don't know that it really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't actually hate this skill variant
Mm-hmm.
uh, for lots of things. I don't hate it uh, partly because right now, strength uh, how many strength skills are there? Strength-based skills,
Mm-hmm.
athletics.
Yeah.
How many constitution-based skills are there?
None.
None. Uh, so you're down to charisma, wisdom, intelligence, dexterity.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and rather than getting into the minutia, especially with new players, I like that idea of
Yeah.
just saying, all right, you're a rogue, so you've chosen, or we've given you a dexterity skill proficiency. So anything you try to do with dexterity, you get this +2 on.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think
but
that's the kind of
when you
advice
get
there
into
should
more
be here.
complex things, yeah, when you get into more complex things like, oh, we're poisoned, I want to create an antidote to this poison. Just to say, well, okay, give me an intelligence check. That seems, just in terms of the reality of the fiction, seems like something you would need a little more training in it. See, that's not like just a quick reaction. That's not inherent to
Mm-hmm.
who you are. That requires the training. So that's where you get into this question. And the other thing to mention with these skill variants is you get one from your class, which there's a chart so you can choose. You also get one from your background. So instead of getting tool proficiencies or skill proficiencies, you just say, well, I'm a rogue, so I have dex from my class. And I did a lot of studying as a youngster, so I'm going to take it in intelligence. And
Mm-hmm.
then we are going to move forward. And one thing this does solve is that idea that, well, I'm a cleric, but religion is a wisdom based religion is intelligence based thing.
Yeah.
You can just say, I'm a cleric, I'm trained in wisdom, and I was a sage, so therefore I'm trained in intelligence. And you can get those fine distinctions that sometimes go
Yeah.
against the rules of what characters are good at.
And that's where it's interesting to
Yeah.
see in these last two options, background proficiency and personality trait proficiency. Background proficiency says there's no skills or tools. And instead of using the ability system, like we're just talking about, you gain your proficiency bonus when your background would apply. And this is a much more loose style, the way it's written here. It's similar to other sort of more indie games. You just sort of say, yeah, hey, look, I'm a noble. So this, I'm trying to talk some guards into doing stuff. Nobles are good at that. I should be able to get a bonus. And so it's a lot more situational. And you say to the DM, I think I should get a bonus because this is my background. I'm trying to hide in the wilderness. Well, I'm a hermit, so it should help. And then personality trait is even more interesting because now we're trying to say that those personality traits that most people don't think a whole lot about when they create in 5e for their character, those things dictate, how you get proficiency bonuses and when. Because this is a thing that ties into my personalities or flaws, and it even has some write up around playing off of flaws, which I think is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And isn't that what 13th Ace does instead of skills?
But
You
better.
just say who you are, right? You say it's like fate. It's like an aspect
Mm-hmm.
in fate. You tell a truth about yourself, and that truth about yourself then dictates the things you are good at as you try to make checks in the game. And when I read that, I'm like, sign me up. Sign me up. Get rid of skill proficiencies altogether. Sign me up for this. This is what I want. This is how I can bring that into my D&D game.
But would you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Because it's
Oh,
interesting to
I absolutely would. I would
I
love.
meet
Yeah.
basically nobody who's doing any of these things, which I think is very interesting.
The only reason I haven't done it is because I usually do organized play,
Mm-hmm.
so I stick to the rules more closely. Would I love to do a game with this? I wouldn't do the class gives you this, background gives you this. I would just do it like 13th Age does it.
Mm-hmm.
You have 10 points to work with. Tell me one true thing, or
Mm-hmm.
three things about yourself, and
Yeah.
give each one a +3,
I was a
and we'll
blacksmith.
go.
I lived in the woods. Then I moved to a city, and here are my 3 skills based on that. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Because I'm a circus performer and I am going to do this acrobatic thing,
Yeah.
here's this. Yep. So yeah, I'm down with that, and I I understand why people aren't. But having played Fate, having played these other games,
Yeah.
I'm cool. Tell me a story. Tell me a story. Let's put the dice down. Tell me a story as much as possible. Speaking of variant skills that are interesting, next we get hero points. So, what does this system do? This gives you a certain number of points. You get 5 plus half your level hero points, and they refresh when you reach your next level. So, you at first level, you would have 5 if we're rounding down. At the end of first level, you lose all your hero points. When you become second level, you get 6 hero points. And those last you your entire level until you hit third, and then you go from there. How do you use them? After you make your roll, but before you would apply the result, you can add a d6 to that roll, any d20 roll, attack rolls, saving throws, skill checks, ability checks. What do you think about that?
It's a lot like Eberron in third edition had this, and it was called confusingly action points. Um, and it was basically this exact thing, but had the concept that you could refresh class features in some ways, like your bardic inspiration or something like that. I think it worked fine then. And you note here that we actually did this for Oracle of War, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, for Oracle of War, we put these in. Uh,
Which was the
I think
organized
it
play
works
campaign for
well.
Eberron 5e, we should say, for those who don't know.
Yep, yep. And what I like about this, I like two things about this with one caveat. I like it better than inspiration because it takes out that need for everyone to be paying attention and the GM to remember to give it and the players to remember to use it. Uh, it puts it in the characters, the players' laps, and says you use it when you need to.
Yeah.
What what I think it works best for are campaigns that are sort of longer. Because if you have a campaign where you're leveling after every 4-hour adventure, it can be too powerful.
Yeah.
If you're only going to have 4 combats and then you level, you can use 1 per combat, or 2 or however, and then you're done. And it also is another thing in the game where you use it at lower levels a lot, and it's very helpful to survive at lower levels. Once you get past 7th level or so, you're failing so few times that you tend to forget about it until it comes to that one bit. Oh, the mind flayer has me in its grip and it's about to suck my brain out. Oh, I need to make this check. Oh, wait, remember we have hero points, even though we haven't used them in 3 sessions. Oh, that's right, hero points. How many do we have? That part of it is a little tricky to keep track of, but overall, I like them.
Yeah, I like them too. It was fascinating to me that hero points show up here, but not action points from 4th edition, which to me is a similar system. And I also like it better than inspiration, especially if inspiration in 2024 ends up being not about role playing or ideas or rewards for being in character or anything like that. And it's just candy. Action point is great candy. And I like hero points as a sort of middle ground where it's kind of candy, but it really helps smooth out those places in the game where you go, man, I really want to not fail this. Or I really feel I should be good at this check, right? I'm making this impassioned speech. This should work, right? I want the game to let me win. So I'm going to roll this die and add to it. So I think it's great. That's one of the optional rules that I would use for a campaign for sure.
Next, we get 2 new ability scores, believe it or not. We get honor and sanity. Well, Teos, I know that I'm short on both, so I will give you the first words on these.
Well, I mean, we know these need to be remade. Both of these are problematic areas we'd want to really run through cultural consultants to rethink this so much about these aspects. But I mean, very transparently, what this is trying to do is to create new ability scores that are used in very specific situations to resolve related checks. So sanity, for example, is meant to resolve checks and saves related to forbidden knowledge. It's a Cthulhu type game, and you find this strange tome of whatevers, and you might have to make a sanity check to use it or to not be tainted by it or whatever. And honor, they mention very explicitly, you're running a Karator campaign, and the idea is that you're playing to this Asian trope, and you need to make these specific checks, and that somehow the game would be better for having an entire ability score dedicated to honor or sanity, depending on this genre. And I mean, I've never liked comeliness or other ability scores that D&D tried to throw into the game over time, and I don't like them now. And I especially don't like these two.
Yeah. I mean, let's just strip away the cultural or the biological aspects of them. Ability scores are supposed to do a certain thing. They're supposed to measure something about your character and who they are. These two things are strange because one of them is not really about who you are. It's about what you do. Right. Honor is supposed to be how you fit within this society and follow its rules or not, and know its rules or not. And it seems strange to me that they're throwing this in here when it's really not an ability score, because it's not who you are, but it's
Mhm.
the choices that you make and what you know about those choices that you make, which seems to me to be not an ability score, but a role playing thing that should be something separate.
Right? Like a track you
Uh,
follow or something rather than, yeah.
right.
Hmm.
And, I could see it being the separate track for, they have like prestige, they have these different, you could do a reputation score. Uh, but again, it wouldn't be an ability score. It would be the separate track. And then sanity, again, pulling out the biological, the sociological thoughts on this. It's hit points. It's its own. It's something that can go up or down based on things that happen to you. It's completely not an ability score. So if you wanted to do something like this, you could have it be a hit point pool, and you could base checks on it that way, but not as an
Yeah.
ability score. It seems sort of weird to me.
I
But
also just feel
yeah.
like all systems like this end up then being problematic when we get into individual campaigns or scenarios, and you find that this
Mm-hmm.
blanket rule that you created up front just doesn't work unless it is a core aspect of your game the way that it is in, Trail of Cthulhu or Call of Cthulhu or something like that. Then you have these core things that you're writing into the game, and all adventures play off of them, and they're thought through that way. I just, this to me won't do much for what we're trying to do. And um yeah, and I feel the same way about the adventuring options have this. I'll just tie it in here because it's sort of related. This fear and
Mm-hmm.
horror options under the next chapter that almost could have been under here because of the topic, but
Mm-hmm.
on fear and horror, and we get rules for applying the frightened condition when facing fearful situations. And for a minute, you're frightened, but you save at the end of each turn, and it's like, well, this is a rule that makes sense only in combat. But because otherwise you just sit around in this room until you're no longer frightened, and but you
Mm-hmm.
need, in theory, this is a rule that should apply to many situations, but it doesn't because it's so narrowly mechanically defined. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's almost better not to have a rule that is supposed
Mm-hmm.
to be a global rule when it's not going to fit all the specific applications, right? Or most specific applications. And horror has a similar
Yeah.
thing here where it's you face something unfathomable, so you do a charisma save where you gain short or long term madness. And it's like, have we thought through how this applies in the middle of a combat or in a long term
Mm-hmm.
situation? It's just, I don't know that
Yeah.
thought went through properly.
Well, it's what we talked about in the previous segment with the poison, right? It's
Hmm.
short term, does it matter? Long term, does it matter? How do you combine the two? Do you need to combine the two? It's generally better off just to leave it for role playing and get the tenor of the game from your players on how they want these sorts of things to affect their characters. Let them play it out if they want, and if they don't want, just jettison it completely and play the game in a more straightforward manner without these optional rules.
Yeah. Hmm.
Also, in adventuring options, we get different tweaks to healing. Some being very interesting and impactful, but very few of them seeing play, at least as far as we've heard. So, Teos, give us your highlights here.
Yeah, healer's kit dependency. Spending a hit die during a short rest requires the use of a healer's kit. Okay. This sort of
Yeah.
there used to be playtest packets that were sort of like this. You can't heal unless you use a healer's kit, but it was a sort of that was like a main source of healing. And I don't know. This just makes you stock up on healer's kits. I don't know. And then
Yeah.
it's a question whether you need proficiency or not, and the healing skill. Are you making a check? But just in a vacuum, just this little rule. I don't think this does a lot for us.
It
Healing
could.
surge. Yeah.
It
Mhm.
Yeah. In a game where money is valuable, yeah, where money means something,
Mm.
making someone pay for a healer's kit in order to heal, that could be a very important thing. That could change the tenor of the game. We need to go out and make money so we could get a healer's kit. But in D&D, it doesn't mean that much.
Yeah.
All it is making the characters spend a small amount of gold or copper or silver in order to spend hit dice at a later point.
Especially when you have a potion of healing that in theory is available.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It needs more, right? And healing surges is another option here. The idea that you can spend an action and you spend a surge and spend up to half of your hit dice. And you can roll and then decide when to stop. But you roll up to half of your hit dice. And then you can't do this again until a short or long rest has happened. And you regain hit dice up to your level divided by 4 with a long rest. Um, and there's an optional rule that lets you do it as a bonus action the way it was in 4th edition. And again, I think this is sort of interesting, right? The idea that you could heal in combat. It gives you more recovery options. I like that. Plus, a lot of times hit dice use isn't happening a lot. Some adventures don't have short rests. So it's a neat rule in that sense. But, when someone says, oh, 5th edition has an optional rule for healing surges, wait a minute. Because 4th edition's healing surges were integral to the system, right?
Right.
Any healing effect, like a magic spell, a power, whatever that someone used on you, spent one of your surges generally, unless it's specified otherwise. And so surges were really a measure of how long you can go on that adventure into that dungeon through these tough situations. And when you ran out of surges, then you were in for it, right? And you could spend many surges because you were often spending them off turn as someone triggered a surge being spent. And so that is a really different gameplay. I think that this healing surge rule could work well if you're doing something like, if you're doing Dragonlance where there aren't any clerics and there aren't any maybe divine casters or casters that can heal, or Dark Sun with very few ways that you could heal, then this could be a nice way to help with that. But to me, this needs a lot more discussion and more teeth to really feel like a real system.
Yeah. Yep, it's something where if you want to give your players an out, you could say, "Hey, once per short rest, you can heal yourself." But as Teos said, don't compare it to 4th edition because it's very, very different in terms of the what healing surges did in 4th edition was put a cap on how much healing could take place during an encounter, and then during a segment of play between 0 and short rest or long rest.
Yeah.
And the game, I think, was better for it then. This 5th edition went back to that 1st and 2nd edition feel of you can heal as much as you want as long as you have the spells or the magic items or the consumables to do it. You could heal 1,000 hit points in a single battle if you needed to, whereas healing surges would stop you from going too far. And both ways are fine, but you have to just be aware of the story implications, the narrative implications, and the mechanical implications of those different methods of allowing people to heal themselves or to heal others.
Yeah, I mean, and it has to do with the overall swinginess of damage and hit points. In 3rd edition, it was very common if you're a frontline fighter that a monster might take 3 attacks on you, and the first 2 might take you down 75% of your hit points, and you're hoping that 3rd hit misses because you might go to 0 in that first round. And so then the healing had to be able to compensate for that. In fact, often what you do is after a combat ended, you'd heal up with a wand to top off. And so 4E was sort of fighting against that sort of tendency and putting controls. 5th edition tends to not have those damage spikes, right? The damage that monsters inflict is way, way down and much more tempered and bound. Sort of the bounded accuracy approach is there for damage infliction as well, such that your healing can be a lot lower and may or may not happen during combat. And if so, is often just to give you a few hit points so that you can come back up, land some blows to end the combat, rather than being, bars go up and down kind of approach. So yeah, all this ties into that, and it's super interesting. The last one here is slow natural healing. What did you think about this option?
I I sort of like this idea of playing around with how you get hit points and hit dice back. So in slow natural healing, a long rest doesn't restore your hit points, but you can spend hit dice as in a short rest to get them back. And I I sort of like this idea if you want a campaign where there's lots of time between adventures,
Mm.
where you are doing other things in the campaign other than just adventuring. And this fits in with downtime, right? You could say, wow, okay, well, we're going to need to rest for a month. We're going to have to rest for 2 months after that Dragon's Lair raid that we
Mm-hmm.
did because we were just decimated. And so during these 4 months, what do we do? Well, this is when downtime kicks in. This is when you can actually tell stories outside. And the rules support that rather than just saying, okay, well, you were all at one hit point after you finished your raid in the Dragon Slayer. You go back to town, you rest, you're ready the next day to go face
Mm-hmm.
the creature that was controlling the dragon. Boom, you're off. And that's why you get level 1 to 20 campaigns that only in game time last a month. Uh, so I like this idea of doing this. You just have to be aware of what it means for the entire length of your campaign story and what it does for that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it doesn't say that it gets rid of the rule for how you restore hit dice, where you get half of them. So it's like you might, you could be really always operating at this sort of uh, real limit on how much healing you can do with a long rest. And it speaks to the way the game used to be. I mean, it used to be that healing would take forever because memorizing spells took a long time. There was only so much healing that you could do. And even especially at low levels, if your cleric, only took healing spells for a few days, that you might still spend a week healing everybody up.
Mhm.
Because your natural healing was, like 1 or 2 hit points a day or something if you used a variant rule or something like that. It was a really low time. And Shadowrun was the same. I remember we'd play Shadowrun, someone would get shot up badly, and you'd be in the hospital for the longest time. And so the rest of the group would be like, well, I'm going to go get some cyberware installed, and I'm going to go hack the matrix of this thing. And yeah, essentially doing downtime because of the fact that the healing, there was just this huge slowdown to the game that would take place. Yeah.
Mhm. Yep. And sort of along those lines are rest variants, where we get the epic heroism, where a short rest is only 5 minutes instead of an hour, or gritty realism, which goes in the other direction, where a short rest is 8 hours, a long rest is 7 days. So that encourages that sort of longer form storytelling that mechanic will elicit in your games.
Yeah.
And I'm cool with all of them. It just
Mhm.
depends on the story that's going to flow out of your play.
Yeah. Yeah, for all of them, I'd like a little
You
more support on what this means. I mean, I know the space is short. Um, as they're written, it feels like it's just idea fodder, but not really an option. And it makes me think back to when D&D Next was being written for the playtest version of 5e. There was this conversation about optional rules modules. And the feeling was that maybe, hey, if you want a 4E style game, you can run optional rule module A, and if you want a, you know, D&D basic, you could do that. And that never really came to happen, you know? So
Mhm.
I just feel um like the game just it I think that was a nice vision. It would have been cool if 5e had some clear modules. We then end up with these pieces, and it's not the same to me. It's a little light and
Yeah.
I think that's why we don't see them used a whole lot. But yeah, it's still
Yeah.
fun to read them and
And
dissect them.
what I would yeah, well, what I would love to see is in an adventure, say, hey, this adventure, we're going to add this optional rule. We suggest you use it for these reasons.
Yeah.
And here we go. right? This adventure, a short rest is 8 hours, and we're going to build the campaign, build the adventure, build the campaign to enhance that, to show you why this is fun in this sense. And then for the next campaign, we're going to do a superhero thing where a short rest is 5 minutes and a long rest is 2 hours, and we are going to blast through levels 1 to 10 in in 10 short sessions, and this is going to be cool for that reason, just
Yeah.
to show
Yeah.
people how you can do these things.
That'd be great. I'd love to see that. I would love it if, Spelljammer, for example, had played with longer rest times or something like that. Just as a campaign
Right.
concept, would be fun.
Well, we are out of time for this episode, but we will get into more of the Dungeon Masters Toolbox Workshop next time. So I want to thank everyone for listening. We do appreciate having your ear holes being filled with our sonorous voices. And thank you specifically to our patrons. They support our Patreon at www.patreon.com/mastering D&D, I believe. Is it mastering D&D or mastering dungeons? I can't remember.
Mastering D&D is the name of the patron, yes, and of everything online. Yep.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you to our supporters there. Shout out to our Master of Realms supporters are in our show notes. And to our Masters of the Multiverse, thank you so much, Keith Amon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Evil John, DM Chad, Darren Chandler, Seth Eckel, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Nathan Fuller, The Mighty Jerd, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Shawn Hurst, Chad Jackson, Brian King, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, the Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, the Micro Ant, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Andy Shockney, Krishna Simonse, Joe Tyler, James Walton, and Graham Ward. Thank you. Again, you can become a patron of the show, and we would much appreciate it getting your support there at patreon.com/masteringdnd. You can also support us by leaving us a review on Apple Podcast, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to see the beautiful faces that go with these beautiful voices. Teos, where can people find you on social media?
I am at alphastream.org. From there, you can get to my YouTubes, all the other efforts, Mastodon, AlphaStream at dice.camp. I should really take out from the show notes that I'm on Twitter because I'm really kind of not, except when I'm retweeting things. So where do we find you, Shawn?
Yep. You can find me still hanging out on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, and the podcast is there at Mastering D&D, on Mastodon as well at Dice Camp, on Blue Sky at Mastering Dungeons and Mastering D&D and Shawn Merwin. Join us on Patreon. Join us on YouTube. So, Teos, we have done our time in the Dungeon Masters Workshop. So what are we going to do now?
I would like to invoke hero points in real life.
And I am going to take 7 days to recover 1 hit point.
Just explain that to your boss.
Because that's all I have. Exactly.